Welcome to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum, a podcast where we explore how to find joy, connection, and growth while navigating the challenges of parenting kids and teens on the autism spectrum. Remember that inclusion and hope are key to making life better for everyone, and that even in the most challenging moments, there's always a lighter side. Now here's your host, David Kohler.
Hello and welcome to the Lighter Side of the Spectrum. I'm David Kohler, and today we're diving into a topic close to my heart. That is creating more opportunities for neurodivergent individuals in higher education. I'm joined today by Megan Kohler, who's the founder and lead consultant of Megan Kohler Consulting. She is also an assistant teaching professor and learning designer at Penn State University. Megan specializes in learning theory and how our brains process information, working directly with the faculty to develop more effective learning experiences for students. Since most faculty aren't formally trained how to teach, Megan provides strategies to make learning more accessible and efficient for all students, including those on the autism spectrum. While her focus is in higher education, I'm personally curious to explore how some of these strategies can influence earlier levels of education, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So for now, let's jump into this great discussion. Megan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff to get over, but why don't we start by talking about your journey? How did you come into this role and this really kind of interesting and important work?
Yeah. So I think there's two pathways to sort of that question. So there's a learning design component, right? And then there's the neurodiversity component. So where would you like to start?
Wherever you want to start. Why don't we start with learning design? Because I think that may be an area that's less familiar to our audience. That's not necessarily kind of mainstream terminology. I think a lot of our audience is more familiar with neurodiversity, but I do want to get into that. But let's talk about what is learning design and how did you get into that?
In all honesty, I kind of fell into it. And that's not that uncommon. That's typically what happens with learning design. And actually, I wrote a book with a colleague about that very notion, is the fact that learning design tends to be a discoverable profession. So it's not something that you initially set out to do. It's just something that you kind of discover along the way. So yeah, actually, I was working as an actor, and it's a long time ago. I used to be a professional actor, and I have toured all up and down the Eastern Coast performing in theater houses and was absolutely loving it. We were holding this workshop on robotics, and it just so happened that the young man who was running the workshop was going back home in the evenings and telling his dad about how helpful I was and about apparently all of these wonderful things, because his father came in the next day and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about a career in instructional design or instructional technology?" And I looked at him and I was like, "What is that?" I had no clue what it was. Yeah. Right. And he said, "Well, why don't you stop by my office? I'm at the local university at Bloomsburg University, and let me tell you about it." Mm-hmm. And I was like, "Okay, well, I've always known that I wanted to be an actor, so there's nothing that's going to deter me from this pathway, but hey, it's worth a conversation, right?"
Yeah.
I went in to meet with him, and next thing I know, he had me signed up for the program. And
he's a good salesman as well.
He is. Yeah. And he was able to get me assistantships and things like that, so that I essentially had a free ride to be able to go through that program. And nice. If it wouldn't have been for all the support that he offered, I probably wouldn't have gone down that pathway. But to sort of contextualize it a little bit, so learning design is sort of synonymous with some other terms. So you may have heard of learning architect or instructional engineer. These are all different terms that are used to describe this. And essentially what it is a person who specializes in taking information and designing it, evaluating it, and delivering it to a group of people. But the goal is to make the learning process as efficient and as effective as it can possibly be.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So it's really kind of helping, I don't want to say translate, but help impact, make sure that the information is impactful. Like I said, you could present information, but if it's just hitting a brick wall, it's not really being very effective necessarily. So you kind of help help making sure that people can process it and understand it and then use it appropriately.
Absolutely. So think about your typical college experience, right? So you go to college and then what do? You attend all these mass lecture courses,
Yeah.
right? And so you're sitting there in a seat for 50 minutes while someone talks to you. That's not the most efficient way of learning information. There are so many other ways that we can present it. We can present it through infographics. We can present it through video. We can chunk it up into smaller pieces and make it more digestible for students. We can integrate
Oh, yeah.
activities so that the students can actually work with the content, get some hands-on experience. And all of these things have been proven to be far more effective than just listening to a lecture. So
Sitting there listening to someone, kind of blather on with a whiteboard or
exactly.
That is really interesting. So I would imagine, again, since it's been a few years that I was in college, I do have I have twin boys. One of whom I think I shared with you, the 19-year-old who's the inspiration behind this program. He has a twin brother who's a freshman at University of Washington. So he's just kind of wrapping up his first quarter there. But I imagine then that he's probably benefiting from some of these strategies. Like I said, his experience, I would think, is a lot different than mine would have been a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many more strategies that we're integrating now, like high flex design, things like the flipped classroom, things like blended learning. And there's actually this notion, really interesting research study. If you're interested in reading more about this, there was a study that was done in which they evaluated what was the most effective way for students to learn. And the students had the perception that the best way to learn was from sitting in a lecture hall listening to a lecture, right?
Okay.
Because it was just information being given to them nonstop. But this research study compared the different modalities. It compared the face-to-face or the in-class lecture.
Yeah.
It compared the blended learning experience, which if you're not familiar with that, it's when you offer part of the information in an online format and then engage in the classroom with the material, or the fully online format. The most effective method by far is the blended learning modality.
Interesting.
Yes. And
That's
so we're
very
seeing,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're seeing a lot more institutions starting to invest in the blended learning piece because it just is demonstrated over and over the efficacy of that approach.
So I'm really fascinated by that. Not only, like I said, kind of at the college level, but like I said, going back to Stone, my son, who I don't think I shared this with you, but really he just started formal education for the first time about a year and a half ago, because he was in the special ed program with the public school district, kind of shuttled away into the intensive ed, didn't really have exposure to academia and all that. But now in the private school that he's in, is what's really cool twofold. And this is what I see kind of connecting with what you're talking about, is it's one-on-one instruction. So he and I go in, I'm his communication partner. So he gets the one-on-one instruction in various classes, but it is paired with online learning. So we combine that with at home, I'll go through because all the curriculum is online. So we're able to kind of read and do things together online. And then the in-class time is spent more on some of the interactive aspects, quizzes, some of those things that kind of require or is more helpful for the teacher to understand the comprehension, and it gives them a chance to interact. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So for me, that's heartening to hear that the research shows that, hey, that's actually really effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So well, let's go ahead and then segue into like the neurodivergent world and your connection there and how this connects as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, so it's a very long journey, but I'll try and
That's all right.
provide the Reader's Digest version. So basically, my husband and I decided to start a family, and we were blessed with a very beautiful, very wonderful little girl. And first couple of years of her life, everything was great. And we sent her to the OCC Montessori school, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Montessori is
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a truly phenomenal program. And everything seemed to be going great. I went in for one of their open houses and they showed me all of the different works that she was doing, and she was able to just knock my socks off with some of the things that she was able to do. And they kept saying about how bright she is and how skilled she is and how she can do all of these things. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. I'm so excited to hear all of this, right? This is all great feedback. And then they said, if you have a few moments at some point, we'd like you to come in. We'd like to have a private conversation with you. And I was like, all right, they're going to tell me my daughter's like a genius and she's ready for high school. And so I went in for the conversation, and you go in, and of course it's like the tiny little chairs that are like half the size. So I'm like sitting down in this little chair. And they start telling me all of these different things that they've noticed about her. And they said, we see that she's not engaging in cooperative play the same way that many of the other kids are at her age. And we noticed that at about 10 o'clock in the morning, she seems to have some difficulty controlling her body. She doesn't sit nicely like the rest of the children do. She tends to want to lay on the floor and roll around. And they're like, we've just noticed these and some other differences. And they had an entire page of differences that they had highlighted and they were talking to me about. And at the end of it, they said, we really think that you should have her evaluated for autism.
Okay.
And
how did that hit you?
like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your experience was in terms of you receiving the diagnosis, but I just remember walking out to my car, getting in my car, and just sitting there and crying. I cried for it must have been an hour to an hour and a half.
Yeah, it hits hard. In our case, it was a little different only because it was not unexpected. We saw, it was kind of a case of where we saw some regression where, again, it was interesting because we had twins, right? So you kind of had these parallel developmental milestones and kind of this built-in comparison. And what was interesting in our case was that Stone was actually kind of hit a lot of these milestones before his twin brother. And was really close to speaking. He never had quite reached that point, but was babbling. We were convinced he was just going to be the talker and that Ty would be the quiet. We said we would have bet on one of them being on the spectrum just based on their behavior. And yeah, they were as babies. We would have totally bet on Ty. But because he did regress and we saw a lot of those signs, I remember I was like watching some show and they're like, does your toddler display, blah, 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 blah. And I remember kind of mentally check. I'm like, And so, yeah, in our case, my wife and I talked about it, got on the list to be evaluated. And yeah, and once it hit, like I say, in our case, it was more confirmation, like, okay, this is what we thought, but it's still like, especially, I won't say especially, but like I said, he's 19 now. So turn the clock back 16 years ago. The diagnosis was very different, right? In terms of kind of the prognosis, what the future is, and he may lose the autism. They would say things like that. So,
oh wow,
yeah,
that's really interesting that they would say something like that. That's very interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone saying that to someone who has a family member diagnosed with autism.
Oh yeah. I mean, this was a previous pediatrician, I will say, that we had dealt with. Oh, he's just slow. And then once we got the diagnosis, oh, well, he can outgrow it. And it's just like, okay, yeah, nice knowing you. We're going to go start this journey with other healthcare professionals. But anyway, so you got the diagnosis and like hit you like a ton of bricks. So go on, please.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that you went on to find different physicians because we were in the exact same position. So the really interesting thing is that she was in fact not diagnosed with autism, but instead diagnosed with ADHD. The process to get to that point was unbelievably challenging. We went to physician after physician after physician, and there were people who would look at her and say, what are you talking about? She's remarkable. There's nothing wrong with her. She's just not getting enough sleep. Here, give her some melatonin supplements. And then there was other people who like just looked at us like well, what do you want me to do about it? And I'm like, well, you're the physician. I want you
Right.
to evaluate her and talk to her, give us a diagnosis, tell us what's going wrong or what's going on here. So we know what it is that we're facing.
Stone's visiting now. He likes to pop in during a lot of times.
Oh,
I'm
that's
sorry.
awesome.
Yeah, it's fun.
So yeah, we would go to see other physicians, and they would be like, well, why do you want a diagnosis for your daughter? And I'm like, it's not that I want a diagnosis, it's that I want to know what we're facing. Because
Yeah.
here I'm having professionals who work with children day in and day out say that there's something different about her. And I want to know what it is so that I can support her in
Right.
whatever it ends up being. And it was such a challenge. We went through 3 years of talking to different people just to try and find out what we were working with.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a
and
long time.
yes, it was a very challenging 3 years of our life. Believe me,
I
not something that I
imagine.
would wish on anyone.
Right.
But yeah, so we got the diagnosis for her. And then as a parent, you want to do everything you can to try and support your child. So I started researching ADHD and looking into it. And at one point during the pathway, I was reading through the list of symptoms and I was like, how you were with your son. And I was like, oh, check, 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 check. And then the light bulb went off for me. And I was like, oh, this explains so much in my life.
Right.
And then as I continue to research it, I realized that there tends to be a lot of support in K through 12 contexts. So students can get the IEPs if they have specific challenges, or if they have specific delays in some way, or there's the 504. But once a child graduates high school,
Yeah.
pretty much all of that support just drops away. And so
Absolutely.
yeah. And so that's why I started down this pathway of saying, you know what? I'm in higher education. My responsibility is to provide students with a quality learning experience. And here there's this entire population of students that are completely being neglected. And it made me really upset and angry.
Right.
And the emotional roller coaster that you go through. And I said, we can do better. And I'm going to make that better because someday my daughter is going to be a college student and I want her to have a good experience because I did not have a good experience. And I think that that's one of our goals as parents is to do all that we can for our kids in order to make sure that they have a better life. And so that's how I got to this point.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, like you said, what a journey. And I really admire the foresight that you have to think, like, again, hey, this is something that's coming, but also it's happening. Like, we know that there's been an explosion in diagnosis of both autism spectrum as well as ADHD and kind of some of those related, neurodivergent situations, right? And so it's great that we have people like you and that others who are looking to address that. Like you said, how can we help this population learn? How can we help them function? Because they are going to be adults. I mean, they're not going to be these cute little kids forever.
That's right. That's right. And the interesting thing is that the concept of neurodiversity and all of the conditions that fit within that are continuing to expand as we learn more about the different types of conditions. So, for example, prior to the pandemic, I don't know, some people are like so averse to that word right now. They're like, don't even say it. I don't even want to hear about it. But prior to that, the concept of prolonged grief disorder was not considered a neurodivergent condition, and it has since been reclassified. So,
Interesting.
So the more that we learn about our brains, that list is just going to keep growing. So it's important for us to be paying attention to it. And I firmly believe, I mean, it's so difficult to find the right numbers in terms of what or how many people who are neurodivergent are actually within our classrooms and within our society. But I believe that number is significantly higher than what we anticipate it to be. So it's approximately 30% in our classrooms. And I think it's quite honestly closer to 50%. I really do.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's, I just think that we're, like I said, a lot more divergent as a population than the expectation, where there's kind of like this built-in bias, I think, of what normal is or typical.
Yes.
And it's actually that world is actually smaller again than what we assume. But you have kind of a bigger population I suppose previously, I think this is one of the great things that's changing is that we're trying to be more accepting of people for who they are and all that they bring. But there was this emphasis, and I think this is one of the areas of criticism for some therapies that our children have gone through, including things like ABA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but these, where it's kind of like, oh, we want their behaviors to fit expectations. And because I think it's a positive that we're moving away from that. And we're introducing strategies into classrooms, into universities, to help them thrive, which is, like you said, what as parents and members of society we would want. I hope you're enjoying the lighter side of the spectrum. So far, we're commercial free, but if you're finding value here, one way to support the show is by considering me for a speaking engagement. I speak on unlocking potential, whether it's for individuals like my son or for entire organizations. I also offer fractional CMO services for businesses needing strategic marketing support without the full-time commitment, drawing on over 35 years of experience in marketing. My agency has helped companies and healthcare practices increase their value, grow, and even prepare for acquisition. To learn more about my speaking topics, visit davidkoffer.com. Or if you're interested in our marketing or fractional CMO services, check out koffermarketing.com. If you're enjoying this episode, please leave a review. Your feedback means a lot, and it helps me make this podcast even more useful. Lastly, don't forget to share it with anyone who would appreciate the insights and stories we're sharing here. Thanks again for listening. I'm curious, what kinds of changes are you seeing? I know you had talked about how you work for the most part, directly with faculty. How has that changed? Are you seeing perceptions change? Are you seeing concrete changes in the way that information's being shared and in the classrooms?
That part is a slow progression because
I'm sure it is.
In order to make the changes, people have to first understand what it is that needs to be changed. And before they understand that there's a change that needs to be made, they need to understand or become aware of the different conditions that they're currently encountering in their classrooms. And so I actually have developed a series of trainings in which I go into different institutions, and at some point we'll hopefully go into different organizations. But I go in and I essentially help faculty understand what neurodiversity really is.
Okay, right.
And
so you've kind of set the baseline, right?
Yes. And it's truly amazing because people who are living with a family member who has some form of neurodivergence, like they could probably tell me more about that condition than I could. So for example, you could tell me more about autism than I could ever know about that subject because you've lived through it, right?
Right.
But then there's also the saying of, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's the case across the board. So if you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. One person with Tourette's, you've met one person with Tourette's, right?
Right.
So there is very much so a component to this that the lived experience is valuable, but there's also the informational perspective that ties into all of this as well. I've developed a set of neuro-inclusive standards that we can use to help faculty actually go about bringing about change within their classrooms. So it ranges from everything to, how do you communicate with your students in a more effective way? How do you make them feel heard? How do you make them feel understood? And one of the most important components about the communication standard that I have in there is to make sure that there's an open option for students to provide feedback to the faculty member.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution because we are all incredibly different. And so I think that that's a critical piece, is to create open pathways for communication around that. But yeah, it ranges from everything to communication, to learning processes, to evaluations, to even the types of technologies that faculty use within their classrooms, and making sure that they're not just choosing technologies because they seem like good technologies to use, but that there's actually support there for the executive function skills.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Are we in the early days of this? I mean, do you consider this to be kind of the infancy of applying learning design to neurodivergent students across the, I mean, are we seeing it across multiple universities, or are we just, is it still in pockets? Can you give us an idea of what's the movement
Yeah.
look like right now?
There are definitely pockets to all of this. So there is a
Okay.
college called Landmark College. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them or not.
I don't think
But
so.
okay, well, so their entire student population is neurodivergent students. In fact, that's what they specialize in. But then there are institutions all across the United States. We're seeing more and more of them starting their own in-house units dedicated to supporting neurodivergent learners, which I think is absolutely fantastic. It's 100% a need that we have. But it also ranges too, because sometimes when I go to give my talks, there are people within the rooms who have never even encountered the term neurodiversity before. Yeah, so
Wow.
it's truly a huge array of experience and exposure and expertise that we're talking about when we encounter these training situations. So my hope is that while I do think we are still at the very beginning of this journey, my hope is that it will catch like a wildfire and that it'll
Yeah.
really take off, and that we'll start to see significant change, and we'll start to see it very quickly. I can tell you that the more faculty who are diagnosed, the more
Oh, yeah.
frequently it becomes integrated into their teaching practices.
Interesting.
And
I mean, it makes sense, but yeah, that's very interesting.
yeah, definitely. And I actually just finished working on a research study in which I was getting feedback directly from students. Okay, what has your experience been like? What are your barriers? What are the challenges that you encounter? And one of the biggest challenges that students are communicating is the fact that faculty don't know what it means to be neurodivergent, and they don't know how to support students. And it's so unfortunate that our students who are neurodivergent are encountering this situation right now, and they're not having that support. So it is a progression, and I just hope that it takes off faster than slower, and that we can really start to see some significant changes soon.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. I think it's one of those things that will pick up momentum. It's we're seeing this in a lot of other areas related, again, from a personal standpoint, with Stone and his communication methodology, the spelling to communicate. As word gets out, because we're seeing, I think, as things become more effective and impactful, of course, nobody spreads the word more than parents, right? Like, we're the best source of information for each other. As soon as you start seeing that, I think you're going to start seeing expectations change, which is good. And right, it's like, hey, why aren't you doing this? Or have you thought about this? I think it will. And like you said, hopefully sooner than later. Okay, so I want to pause here because this is one of the times I'll do our segment called Tip of the Week. So Dave, why don't we go ahead and kick that off?
Hey parents, gather around, it's time to speak. We're here with your tip of the week. Strategies and wisdom just for you. Autism parents, we know what you go through.
All right, tip of the week. And Megan, you might actually have two tips this week, right?
I do have two tips this week. So my first tip would be for parents, young people, whatever your situation is, I would encourage you to check out a piece of technology that has really been helping me a lot lately, and it's called the Apollo Neuro. Now, I'm not a big tech proponent person. In fact, if you know what my experience has been in higher education and the different types of technologies that I encounter, I'm much more likely to say, no, put that technology aside. But this one has actually been really impactful in my life. So I'm just coming off of giving 4 presentations at a conference, 3 of which were about neurodiversity. And I can sometimes get extremely nervous. And if my ADHD gets going really heavily, I can start to talk really, 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 really fast. And
I know nothing about that.
Right. And so with the Apollo Neuro, it's basically this little device. I have it on right now because it helps me stay focused. Let me just bring it up here. So it's this cool little black box. And it has these 2 buttons on the side, and it has this really cool little metal piece across the top. And what you do is you can either strap it onto your wrist or onto your ankle. And it has a series of different options for you to be able to essentially support yourself. So we'll just give it a second here to bring this up.
Wow. Like I've never heard of that.
It's not going to show up very well. But yeah, so
we'll
it
get
has
a screenshot that we can share with others. We'll go ahead and include that.
That sounds great. I'll take a screenshot and send it over to you. So it has all of these different settings that you can choose from. So if you want more energy, you can choose the energy option. You can choose focus. You can choose calm. You can use it to help you sleep better, to take a power nap. And basically what it does is it emits very mild vibrations. And I got to be honest, when I first heard about it, I was a total skeptic. I was like, oh, this doesn't seem legit. Like, how could all of these little vibrations simply help you manage your mood? But then my daughter was diagnosed, and I was like, okay, I'm willing to try anything. And so we got it for her. And of course, being the parent I am, I'm not going to put anything on my kid that I wouldn't put on myself.
Right.
So I put it on and I tried it, and I was like, I just might keep this for me. It works. I'm joking. Yes, it works. It definitely works. And I was, quite frankly, really surprised. So I can get a lot of pre-presentation jitters, even though I used to be an actor and I've got the stage fright thing under control. And I walked into all of my presentations with the Apollo Neuro on, and I just felt calm and collected and ready to go. So it definitely helps. It's something that I would definitely encourage people to check out.
I'm going to check that out. That's a fabulous tip. So how long have you been using it, Megan?
Oh gosh, I don't even remember. It's been years, honestly. I'm going to say maybe 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Oh, that's a long-term testimonial. I mean, that's not something like you just tried a couple months ago. No, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I thought so too. And there's so many different tech options that they're coming out with now. They've got video games and all sorts of other options to try and help students who are neurodivergent, especially kids with ADHD. Like, they've got these video games that you can try and focus on keeping a balloon, like a hot air balloon, raised off in the distance, and if you look away from the balloon, it'll start to drop. And simply that visual connection with that balloon helps stimulate the brain, and it increases a child's ability to focus. So there's a lot of really remarkable technologies that are coming out nowadays.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I think probably just the challenge again for parents is just sorting through it all, right? Like that.
Yes.
So that's why testimonials such as yours are really helpful. All right, what was your second tip that you have?
So my second tip is reframing, and this is one that I absolutely love. So I don't know if you know a lot about habit forming or things like that, but as a person with ADHD, I find it really, really hard to form new habits.
Absolutely.
My brain functions in a certain way, and that's the way it functions, right? And so reframing has been really helpful for me lately in terms of being productive. And so basically with framing, it's just you look at a situation differently than what you initially looked at it with, or the lens that you looked at it with. So I'll think of a simple one here that probably almost everybody can relate to. So dieting, right? So if you think, oh, I want to lose weight, and here's my choice for dinner. I've got pizza or I've got chicken with broccoli and rice. Well, psychology already tells us that as human beings, we only have so much willpower, right? So if we've been going through an entire day at the office, skipping the donuts and the brownies and the soda and all the other stuff, but then we come to dinner time and our willpower is essentially drained. Instead of looking at the pizza and thinking, I really want that pizza because it's going to taste so much better than that chicken, you look at it differently, right? You say, you know what? I don't want that pizza because it's full of the grease and all sorts of other things that are really unhealthy for me. What I want is the chicken because that's going to make me feel good and I'm going to feel better about myself. So you literally just reframe how you're looking at this situation. And it's great for productivity, right? Because with people who have ADHD, we're prone to procrastination, as are many different types of individuals with neurodiversity or neurodivergent conditions. And so you reframe it like, it's not that I don't want to work on that task, or it's not that that task is going to be so hard. You sit down and say, I get to work on that task. I'm going to do this,
That's
and it's
good.
going to be a great experience. And it really can influence the outcome. It's amazing how much control we actually do have over our brains, and how we can sort of convince ourselves to approach things differently.
Absolutely. That's a great tip. And like I said, I've never been formally diagnosed with ADHD. I took a test just to see, because I was convinced. I'm like, again, feel like you check the boxes or whatever. And I was like, I'm going to, if there's such a thing as acing an ADHD test, I thought for sure. Right. But I got it back. They're like, nope, you don't qualify. I was like, oh, okay. But I think you could have a lot of the characteristics. And again, a
Right.
diagnosis, it's what it is. I mean, the procrastination, all those things are things I think many of us can relate to. And I think, again, a lot of us would agree it's only gotten worse
Yeah.
with the advent of technology, with the crazy world we're living in. There's just the distraction, all this stuff, right? Like it
Yeah.
really is a lot more challenging to stay on task and stay focused than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, and so then you call into the mix things like VAST, variable attention stimulus trait, which is another condition that
I've never heard of that.
Oh, you have to read about it. So a lot of people who think that they have ADHD can sometimes not have ADHD, but instead they might have VAST. And so basically VAST is just this way that our brains have been conditioned to be more easily distracted through all of the buzzing and the beeping and the sounds and everything else that goes on. So the good news is that you can actually recondition yourself out of VAST, but it takes effort. Now that said, there are so many stories I could share with you about people coming up to me after I've given a talk, and they're just like in tears saying, I went and I took the test and they told me that I didn't, but I know that I do. And I think it can become really, really difficult for somebody who feels that they have a condition, but yet test really well. And quite frankly, I've never been officially diagnosed. I've been diagnosed by my PCP, but not gone out and gone through the formal evaluation that you have to go through with a certified psychiatrist. I haven't done that because I know that I would test too well.
Okay, interesting.
And I'm also at a point in my life where it's not really like having that official diagnosis isn't really going to change my life in any way. I've already set up different metrics and measures and processes for managing myself. But to somebody who is like my daughter, she's still in school, having that diagnosis gives her access to additional supports.
Absolutely.
If at some point, like if she needs additional testing time at some point, now she can get that because she has that formal piece of paper, which is a whole other thing that we could unpack in a completely different conversation about the lack of support offered to individuals who don't have an official diagnosis. And it's frustrating. It is so, so frustrating.
I would love to talk about that. I think we need to do a part 2 at the future and talk about it, especially like you said, the lack of support in that particular area, but just in general, right? In terms of neurodivergent students and areas of improvement that are needed. I would love to hear more about that because, like I said, it's a little different from our experience where we actually had the paper. Not sure how helpful it was, and at the end of the day, but I can only imagine just how much more frustrating it would be to try to get support even without having that officially. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's so many hoops that you have to jump through to get that diagnosis to begin with. And like I said, I've had so many people just in tears telling me their story, and your heart breaks for these people, right?
Yeah.
Because you wish that there was something you could do. The best advice that I've been able to give them is like, if this is what you're encountering, like, and I fully respect and understand the medical field, but I have also been a person who's been misdiagnosed with so many conditions throughout
Oh
my
my
entire
gosh, yes.
lifetime.
Right.
Everything that we went through, my daughter, it's
Well, standardized tests are just that, right?
right.
They're based on these standards that aren't necessarily applicable to each individual. We're all so uniquely wired and configured, and right. I think it's impossible to have something that, and they just rely on numbers rather than, like you said, knowing the person and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I was an actor, I actually used to work as what they call a standardized patient. So what you do as a standardized patient is you go in and you basically meet with a physician and you go through a list of symptoms that you have. And the reality is that the vast majority of the time, the physicians are really just giving you a best guess. And so I'm a big proponent of your body and your brain better than anybody else.
Absolutely.
So if you feel like something's different or something's out of sorts, don't give up. Keep pushing until you get the answers that you need and that you deserve.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's sometimes hard for people to do that, right? Again, we're kind of conditioned to trust the experts. There's a lot of messaging that goes into who are the experts and who are the people who, and it's easy to fall into that. And again, kind of give up that control. But I think grabbing that control for yourself, and like I said, for your children especially, is so critical. Well, Megan, we're almost out of time, but before we go, I wanted to do our fact or fiction segment, because again, I thought you had a great fact or fiction. So Dave, we get to do that cue as well.
Get QuickTime ready, and here we go. This is Autism Fact or Fiction. We're breaking down what's real, what's rumor, and what might surprise you. Let's go.
All right, fact or fiction, what do you got, Nick?
For the fact or fiction that I have today, it is the perception that individuals with autism are all poor communicators. And
Fiction.
yes, it is fiction. And in fact, there was a research study that was recently released, and it talked about how, so basically what the research study did was it took pieces of communications from individuals with autism and it presented it in various formats to individuals who are neurotypical. So they took a piece of written content, they took a piece of an audio recording, and they took a piece of a video recording, and they presented it to the neurotypical individuals. And the really interesting thing is that when they were presented with the written communication, the neurotypicals couldn't detect any difference whatsoever. When they were presented with the audio clip and the video clip, there was something about the way that the people with autism were presented, the way that they presented the information, the way that they spoke, the style, the pacing, any number of different variables. But the neurotypicals were able to pick up on the fact that that individual was different. And as a result, they made, and it's the title of the paper, thin slice judgments about those individuals. So without knowing anything about them, they had already made the decision that they did not want to continue interacting with that individual.
Right.
And that's what happens the vast majority of the time, is that if you are perceived to be different, you are other, and therefore other does not belong. And so neurotypicals will tend to gather with other neurotypicals. And this is incredibly unfortunate, and it's another one of those reasons why we need to be continuing our work to combat these stigmas and to be breaking down these barriers, because that is absolutely not the case. And I know from my own experience, and I'm sure you can speak from your experience as well, that if you have a neurodivergent person in your life, you know how incredible they are. You know how loving and caring and compassionate and wonderful of a human being they are. And I personally believe, and this was actually part of the speech that I gave at the conference, was that if we thought like neurodivergent individuals, the world would be a better place. It really would.
Okay.
I believe
It would. I do. I know so. I know so. Oh yeah, I could go on and on. No, I mean, they're more interesting. They're more complex. They're more thoughtful. I mean, the list goes on compared to neurotypical people in my mind. I think it is a higher form of thinking, but
Yeah.
like I said, we could go on.
Well, and so I'll add just one more piece to
Okay,
that.
sure. Yeah. Go for it.
So if you are interested, I would encourage you to take a look at the concept of the uncanny valley. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Oh, you got to dig into this.
Okay. Yeah.
So the uncanny valley is the notion that is, or it's a concept that's applied quite frequently to robotics. So as they work to make robots more and more human-like, they become more and more off-putting to human beings.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. And so that's the concept of the uncanny valley. And there are people who are sort of taking that notion of the uncanny valley and kind of applying it to people who are neurodivergent, because it's like this, we look like each other and we talk like each other, but there's something that's different. And so it's has this notion of turning neurodivergent individuals away, or turning neurotypical individuals away from people who are neurodivergent. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done there before we fully understand those connections, but it's definitely something worth taking a closer look at.
For sure. Yeah, I'll take a look at that. But again, thank you, Megan. I mean, like I predicted ahead of time, we could talk a long time about this stuff. There's a lot of ground to cover. I would love to bring you back and talk about some of these other topics that we had touched on. Education. Did get a chance to talk about corporate training and, again, how this can be applied in kind of the corporate and professional environment. But for now, we'll have to call it a day. Thank you, everyone. That's David Kohler. Make sure you share this with others who may find it interesting. Megan, thanks again.